Hi everyone and welcome to Truth Over News. In our last episode, we told you about the shockingly quick approval and development of the mRNA vaccines in early January 2020, before the COVID pandemic had reached national attention. Now, if you recall, we unearthed an SEC filing in which pharma giant Moderna admitted that on January 13, 2020, Fauci and Moderna agreed to go ahead with mobilization towards manufacturing of the mRNA COVID vaccines on a mass scale. Now, bear in mind, Chinese authorities had only shared the genetic sequence of COVID 2 days before this agreement was reached. Additionally, we also know that the CEO of Moderna claimed that he knew there would be a pandemic sometime in late 2019, and he asked for a huge ramp-up in production efforts. All of this got us thinking and revisiting some things we had uncovered more than 2 years ago, things that didn't fit in all that well with what we knew at the time, but have now gained newfound relevance. As always, we'll present facts, but this episode may end up being more typified by the questions raised than any actual conclusions. Nevertheless, we think this will prove very interesting and hope that you bear with us. There's always been a number of things which have troubled us, and by no means will all of these things be covered in this show, but we do want to revisit some big ones. Although many are unaware, mRNA technology was developed decades back, but was not deployed because of the inherent instability of RNA. As a paper from Johns Hopkins notes, the biggest challenge was that mRNA would be taken up by the body and quickly degraded before it could deliver its message, the RNA transcript, and be read into proteins in the cells. As the paper from Hopkins notes, the solution to this problem came from advances in nanotechnology, the development of fatty droplets, lipid nanoparticles that wrapped the mRNA in a bubble, which allowed entry into the cells. Once inside the cell, the mRNA message could be translated into proteins, like the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, and the immune system would then be primed to recognize the foreign protein. Although we are by no means endorsing mRNA, this short clip helps to explain the technology.
Unlike some other types of vaccines, mRNA vaccines do not contain any pieces of the virus. Instead, the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine teaches our own cells to make the quote-unquote spike protein found on the surface of the coronavirus, triggering an immune response. In short, they help our bodies produce antibodies specific to the virus, along with T cells that also confer immunity. That sounds great, right? But I bet you're thinking, how exactly does this work? Well, it works by simply reproducing the same immune response that happens in a natural infection, but without actually infecting your body.
The first place the new mRNA technology was employed was in the development of new mRNA vaccines that were intended for use against the 2018 outbreaks of Ebola in West Africa. Previously, live attenuated vaccines were used during the 2014-15 outbreaks of Ebola. And while they proved to be quite effective, costs, cold storage requirements, and difficulty in adapting to new virus variants caused production issues. As a result, the new mRNA technology was used to develop cheaper vaccines in 2018. As a paper from NIH noted, most current Ebola virus vaccine candidates are based on viral vectors, some of which cause side effects or require complex manufacturing. As the paper also stated, there's no commercially available vaccine against Ebola. Now, note the important distinction here. A viable vaccine, Ervebo, already existed, but it was not commercially viable, meaning profitable. By contrast, modified mRNA vaccines are easily produced and are highly immunogenic. Increased profitability is why the attempt to move towards an mRNA version began. But the problems of scale, cost, and profits remained. As Johns Hopkins pointed out, the first mRNA vaccines using these fatty envelopes were developed against the deadly Ebola virus. But since that virus is only found in a limited number of African countries, it had no commercial development in the US. So from the viewpoint of the pharma companies, they had this newly improved mRNA technology that they theoretically could use to make much cheaper vaccine alternatives. Remember that mRNA shots are not truly vaccines, but they had no large commercially viable markets in which to sell this new technology. And of course, there were no long-term safety studies of the mRNA vaccines. In other words, If things continued as they had pre-COVID, it would have likely been years, perhaps even decades, before mRNA vaccines would have been accepted or used in the Western world. We bring up the early forays of the mRNA Ebola vaccines for two reasons. The first is to highlight the obvious point that the use of mRNA technology began with Ebola outbreaks in West Africa, likely leading to a pent-up desire on the part of Big Pharma to employ the same technology in much larger commercially viable markets. The second is because we wanted to provide you with a closer look at the Ebola outbreaks themselves. As it turns out, there are some very real questions as to how these Ebola outbreaks came about. And to make matters even more interesting, some very familiar names come up in the Ebola outbreak stories. The 2014-2016 Zaire Ebola outbreak in West Africa was by far the largest and deadliest in history, with more than 29,000 people becoming infected, resulting in over 11,000 deaths. The origin of that outbreak has been blamed on a 2-year-old boy from a remote village in Guinea who was said to have become infected after playing with bats in a local tree. However, there was a significant problem with this theory of zoonotic or animal-to-human transmission that the studies seemed to gloss over. In all of the live bats that were captured from the area, no trace of Ebola was found. The zoonotic narrative of the little boy also fails to account for how the outbreak suddenly emerged in Sierra Leone and in Liberia. In the first of what will be several surprising coincidences, the person who led the study that determined the Ebola outbreak came from bats, Fabian Leendertz, also happens to be one of the authors of the fraudulent World Health Organization report, which claimed that COVID came from nature. Other names involved in the COVID natural origin narrative that were part of that WHO report, including EcoHealth's Peter Daszak and Marion Koopmans, should be familiar to viewers of our show. All of this has led to some real speculation that the 2014 Ebola outbreak may actually have come from a lab, which, as it turns out, existed in the region and appears to have been conducting experiments on, you guessed it, the Zaire Ebola virus, the most lethal of all the Ebola viruses. The Zaire virus is also the same virus that caused the 2014 outbreak, the first proven emergence of Zaire Ebola virus in West Africa. Which is strange because Zaire Ebola had traditionally been found only in the Congo Basin, more than 3,000 kilometers from Guinea and Sierra Leone. Ebola, although deadly, is not highly contagious and requires direct contact with bodily fluids of an infected host. It is not conducive to widespread geographic contagion. Additionally, later genomic sequencing and phylogenetic analysis proved that the 2014 outbreak resulted from a single jump into humans. Researchers Sam Husseini and Jonathan Latham note that zoonotic outbreaks, including most past Ebola outbreaks, typically feature multiple jumps to humans from an animal source. Single jumps, however, are consistent with lab origins and are often considered a red flag for that possibility. The researchers also noted that Zaire Ebola is the species favored by civilian and military research labs for studying Ebola-type viruses precisely because of its high mortality rate and concurrent biowarfare potential. All of this brings us to the Kenema laboratory that was run by some very familiar figures from the COVID natural origin cover-up. As a 2022 report by Husseini and Latham noted, after Ebola was first confirmed by laboratory tests in mid-March 2014, persistent rumors in the region linked the outbreak to a U.S.-run research laboratory in Kenema, Sierra Leone, which conducted studies of viral hemorrhagic diseases, a class of diseases that includes Ebola. The Kenema lab has been operated by the U.S.-based Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium, or VHFC, since 2010. The president of VHFC is none other than Robert Gary. The vice president of VHFC is Christian Anderson. As you likely recall, both men were direct participants in Fauci's secret teleconference, where the COVID natural origin was hatched. Both men privately told Fauci and the rest of the group that they believed COVID originated from a lab while publicly claiming that COVID had a natural origin. Both men were co-authors of Proximal Origin, the paper used by Fauci and the media to dismiss the possibility of a lab leak. And both men were the co-recipients of a new $8.9 million 5-year grant in May 2020 that established the West African Research Network for Infectious Diseases. When speculation of a lab leak as the cause of the Ebola outbreak began, Gary denounced the stories as conspiracy theories, saying that we were there working 10 years and then Ebola came here. We're not here to turn Lassa and Ebola into a kind of superweapon. It can do that on its own. But there's several problems with Gary's claim. In 2011, Reuters profiled the Kenema lab, referring to it as an outpost of the U.S. government's war on terror, funded by a surge in biodefense spending since the airplane and anthrax attacks on New York and Washington a decade ago. That same Reuters article also noted the huge safety lapses present at the Kenema lab, stating that in Kenema, it is impossible to create the same levels of protection for researchers that they would experience in a Western lab. In the United States, Lassa virus is handled in biosafety level 4 facilities, where researchers wear spacesuits. But in Kenema, measures include goggles, gloves, and masks. In 2013, VHFC posted an article on its website titled, "Researchers at Scripps Research Made Major Advances in the Fight Against Ebola Virus." Unfortunately, while a snapshot of the article on the website resides on the Wayback Machine, the article itself was removed before it could be saved. Nevertheless, it seems quite odd that the article would be posted at all if they were not doing work on Ebola. And notably, Anderson is a professor at Scripps Research, and his bio notes that his work included the Ebola virus, West Nile virus, and Lassa virus. In 2022, Gary wrote an article in which he claimed that we did not have Ebola in our laboratory and therefore could not have released or engineered it. But that statement is contradicted by Anderson, who admitted in a podcast that we had been studying Ebola in Kenema in Sierra Leone, and lo and behold, Ebola emerged just a few miles from there in 2014.
One of the new ones is the Ebola lab leak, which also is being blamed on us because we have been studying Ebola in Kenema in Sierra Leone, and lo and behold, Ebola emerged just a few miles from there in 2014, right? Obviously across the border in Guinea, but it's maybe 100 miles or so away. And people then put that together and say, oh, so that Ebola must have been a lab leak too. And it was Robert Gary and Christian Anderson again. And the reason why these names keep coming up and the reason why we get grant money to study infectious diseases is because we study infectious diseases.
Note that Anderson admitted that the outbreak was just a few miles from there, before he quickly tried to claim that Ebola emerged 100 miles away. Anderson also tried to pretend that assertions that a leak from the Kenema lab caused the Ebola outbreak were post-COVID, when in fact this claim had been made by a number of scientists ever since the 2014 Ebola outbreak began. Nor is this the first time that Anderson tried to shift blame for the Ebola outbreak away from his lab. In 2015, Anderson gave a speech on the Ebola outbreak at the European Bioinformatics Institute, where he attempted to blame the Ebola outbreak on migrating bats as a means to explain the 3,000 kilometers between the Zaire Ebola virus's natural home in the Congo and the outbreak in Guinea and Sierra Leone. It was this exact explanation that was later used to explain how COVID showed up in Wuhan, more than 1,000 miles from the natural bat population. Of course, neither of these attempts provide any explanation as to how a virus would travel in bats for 1,000+ miles without leaving a trace along the way.
How did that happen? Did somebody jump on a plane and fly over and then you got Ebola? Probably not. I think the much more likely explanation, that at least that's the explanation I favor, which is that, okay, if we believe that bats serve as the reservoir for Ebola, what you can imagine is that you have an infected bat here that then flies out into the forest, and this bat then meets some other bats and then infects those bats. And those bats then fly back into where they come from, meet some other bats and infect them.
It's quite clear in this case that it came across through animals. And almost all our diseases, like HIV, crossed over from chimpanzees in Africa quite some time ago. Ebola came from bats. This also, with one step in between, came from bats.
We found it notable that Bill Gates also claimed that Ebola came from migrating bats, while simultaneously claiming that migrating bats, rather than a lab leak, were the origin of COVID. We've also always wondered why Anderson was brought in by Fauci to run cover for the lab leak in Wuhan. He was a recipient of a lot of grant money from Fauci, but he had very little experience with coronaviruses. A screenshot from Anderson's site in February 2020 made no mention of coronaviruses, but that was suddenly updated 1 month later to include them as a specialty. Regardless of what you think of the evidence presented here, one thing is clear. Anderson did have previous experience defending accusations of a lab leak while simultaneously promoting a natural origin for a major pandemic. Now, before ending, we would like to point out 2 other events that would seem to tie into our earlier discussion on mRNA vaccines. On September 10, 2019, just as COVID began, Johns Hopkins published an 84-page study titled Preparedness for a High-Impact Respiratory Pathogen Pandemic. In other words, the perfect description of COVID. The report warned that were a high-impact respiratory pathogen to emerge, either naturally or as the result of accidental or deliberate release, it would likely have significant public health, economic, social, and political consequences. The report was commissioned and prepared for the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, a WHO-related organization of 15 politicians and scientists. Of those 15 board members, 3 prominent members jumped out: Anthony Fauci, Jeremy Farrar, and Gao Fu. Fauci and Farrar co-organized a secret teleconference on February 1, 2020 that created the natural origin narrative. Gao Fu is the director of China's CDC. The report noted that nucleic acid, RNA, and DNA-based vaccines are widely seen as highly promising and potentially rapid vaccine development pathways, though they have not yet broken through with licensed products. The report recommended that mRNA vaccines should be both pursued and funded. It also recommended that agencies fast-track mRNAs in emergencies and push for surge production of the mRNA vaccines. 2 days after the report was published, the Wuhan Institute of Virology's database of viral sequences was suddenly taken offline in the middle of the night. 1 week later, on September 18th, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board issued a formal warning about the possibility for a global pandemic, stating that the world is not prepared for a fast-moving, virulent respiratory pathogen pandemic. By this time, COVID was very likely beginning its early spread through Wuhan. We told you in our previous show how Fauci worked with Moderna to begin immediate mobilization towards manufacturing the mRNA COVID vaccines on a mass scale on January 13, 2020. But there's one final item. On February 19, 2023, the CEO of Moderna, Stéphane Bancel, told the assembled World Economic Forum audience that he knew sometime in late 2019 that there would be a pandemic.
When the pandemic happened, Moderna had made 100,000 doses in 2019 for the whole year. And I remember walking after Davos into the office of my head of manufacturing, and I say, how will we make 1 billion doses next year? And they look at me a bit funny, say, what? I say, yeah, we need to make 1 billion doses next year. There's going to be a pandemic.
Exactly how Bancel knew that there would be a pandemic in late 2019 and a need to ramp up production from 100,000 doses to 1 billion doses was never answered. But the answer to this question may answer a number of other questions as well. And it certainly feels like we're getting closer to the truth. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Truth Over News.